Um, this might make you laugh and also maybe shake your head a bit.
Yep.
We're going over to Kenya, where their members of parliament, their MPs, are facing some issues with their pay.
Yeah. It's an interesting situation, especially when you think about everything that was going on. Remember those protests that were led by the youth back in June of 2024?
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, they were really upset over those proposed tax hikes.
Yeah, I remember those things got pretty heated.
Oh, absolutely. And you know what? Those protests actually led to something pretty historic. Young people actually stormed the Kenyan Parliament building for the very first time ever, and it forced these MPs to back down from a pay raise that they were trying to push through.
Wow, that's what they call people power.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. They already make a pretty decent salary. 725,502 Kenyan shillings every single month.
Wow.
Which, to put that into perspective, is significantly higher than the average Kenyan income.
Right. It's a huge difference. And it's really at the center of this whole issue. You know, now that they're appointing a new Salaries and Remuneration Commission, the SRC, well, the MPs are starting to speak up again. They're saying that they want that raise, and they aren't really being quiet about why they think that they deserve it.
Well, let's unpack this then. So we've got this recent article from Kenya's Daily Nation newspaper. They dove into all this drama. And from what I've read, some of these arguments from the MPs are, well, they're interesting. So some are saying that they deserve a raise because of all the work that they do.
I mean, isn't that kind of ironic? I mean, they're in this position of power representing the people, and it seems like they're more focused on how much money they're making than actually, doing the job. And they're already making more than the average Kenyan.
Exactly. And it gets even better.
Mm-hmm.
One MP is claiming that they're spending all of their earnings on their constituents, who then turn around and basically vilify them.
Wow, there's a real disconnect there. It's almost like they see this role as some kind of like charity instead of a public service.
Yeah.
One that, requires them to make these personal sacrifices with their money, for their constituents.
It's kind of a weird perspective to have. And then on top of that, some MPs are worried about how this is all going to make them look.
Yeah.
They're warning this new SRC not to try and demonize them or make them look uneducated.
It is interesting how they seem so focused on how they look and how smart people think they are instead of trying to, address the very real economic problems that Kenyans are facing.
I mean, it really seems like some of these MPs are living on a different planet. The country is facing all this economic hardship, and here they are worried about how they look, complaining that they're not getting even more money on top of what they already make.
Right. It really does seem like a textbook example of politicians being out of touch with, the everyday people that they're supposed to be representing. And it happens everywhere. You see this same kind of thing play out in democracies all over the world.
It makes you wonder, though, doesn't it? What are they thinking? I mean, is it that they really believe that they deserve more, or is there something else going on?
Well, it's hard to say for sure, of course, but it really makes you think about what drives people to get into politics. Is it really about serving people, or are they more interested in status and making themselves richer?
Yeah. And what about all the people they represent? I mean, you'd think they would at least try to be a little more aware of how these demands might look, especially after those protests.
Right. But it seems like for some of them, the chance to get more money is more important than anything else, even how it might hurt their reputation.
Yeah.
Or maybe they just think they can spin it somehow and make it work out for them.
Well, that's a risky move, especially these days with social media. One wrong step and you become a meme.
Absolutely. And the optics of this whole thing are just terrible. Politicians trying to give themselves more money when regular people are struggling to buy food.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a recipe for disaster.
It's like they don't even learn from history. There are tons of examples of politicians getting in trouble for putting their own financial interests ahead of everybody else.
Right. Some lessons just seem harder to learn, I guess. But maybe this will be a wake-up call, not just for Kenya, but for all politicians.
Yeah, maybe this will remind them that they actually have to answer to the people.
Exactly. And that, in today's world where information spreads so quickly, trying to put yourself ahead of everyone else can have some serious and quick consequences.
It's interesting how all of this is a good example of the struggle between serving the people and just being selfish. It's a tough balance and something that gets tested all the time.
Yeah. And what's at stake is really important. If people stop trusting our institutions, our democracy won't work right. And when that trust is gone, it can have some big consequences.
So if we kind of take a step back, what does all of this mean for Kenya? What could happen because of all this back and forth with the MPs and this pay raise?
Well, for one thing, it could make people even more distrustful of the government and the people in charge. People are already struggling, and seeing politicians trying to take more money is only going to make things worse.
Yeah, and that could lead to even more unrest, right? I mean, more protests, more people demanding that the government be accountable.
Oh, absolutely. And it could also encourage civil society groups and activists to push for more transparency in how the government spends money and makes decisions. People are tired of feeling like they aren't being heard, and they are more and more willing to take action to make things change.
It's like this whole thing with the MPs has become a symbol of a much bigger problem.
Yeah.
The separation between the people in charge and the regular everyday people.
And that's not just happening in Kenya, it's a global thing. People all over the world are feeling let down by the traditional ways that politics works, and they're demanding more from their leaders.
Yeah, they want to see that their representatives are putting the needs of the people first, not just lining their own pockets.
Exactly, and they're ready to fight for it.
This has been a really interesting deep dive so far. It's amazing how something as simple as Kenyan MPs wanting more money can turn into a conversation about such big and important ideas. But before we go too deep, let's bring it back to our listener for a minute. What are some of the key things we can take away from all of this?
Well, first of all, it's important to remember that people can make a difference when they put pressure on the government. Those protests last June showed that when people come together and speak up, they can force even the most powerful people to listen.
Yeah, it really shows that we can make a difference. We're not just watching from the sidelines.
Exactly. And it reminds us that we have a duty to hold our leaders accountable, to make sure that they're doing their jobs and working for us, not just themselves.
And second, it shows just how important it is for politicians to think about how their actions look to the public, especially when those actions seem selfish or like they don't understand what regular people are dealing with.
Exactly. In a world where there's constant news and social media perception is everything, and trying to justify something like giving yourself more money can really backfire when people think it's out of touch or insensitive.
It's a good lesson for anyone in a position of power, whether it's in politics or business or anything else. People are always watching and judging.
That's right. And finally, what's happening in Kenya is a good example of how people all over the world are becoming disillusioned with how politics works. People want more transparency, more accountability, and they want their leaders to actually respond to their needs.
Like they're calling for a way of governing that is more authentic, more focused on the people.
Exactly. And that's a conversation that's just getting started.
Okay, so we've talked about the problems and, the disconnect, the optics, but is there a way to fix this? Not just in Kenya, but in all those other places you were talking about, where politicians seem to forget, who they're actually working for.
Yeah, that's the real question, isn't it? I mean, if it was easy to fix, I'm sure somebody would have figured it out by now. But there are definitely things that we could try, ideas that might help to close that gap.
Okay, well, give me some hope here. I'm listening.
Well, some people think that we need to completely change how we pay our elected officials. Like, what if instead of just giving them a set salary, we tied their pay to how well they actually do their jobs?
Oh, wow, that's interesting. So you mean like how much they actually get done for the people they represent? So they would actually have to earn their pay.
Right, exactly. Like we could tie their pay to things like showing up for work, participating in debates, or actually completing projects that help their communities. Make a clear connection between what they do and how much they get paid.
But wouldn't that be hard to measure? Like, how do you decide if a project is successful? Or what counts as good attendance? It seems like it would be pretty subjective.
You're right, it wouldn't be easy. It would take some really clear and measurable criteria. And it might even need input from independent experts and organizations to make sure it's fair and transparent. And even then, we'd still need some checks and balances to make sure no one is manipulating the system.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to create a system where politicians are just chasing numbers instead of actually serving the people.
Right. Another idea is to give citizens a more direct say in how much their representatives get paid.
Like actually voting on their salaries. That seems kind of extreme.
Well, it could be done in different ways, like maybe regular surveys where people can give feedback on how their representatives are doing and suggest how much they think they should be paid, or citizen-led committees that could review salaries and make recommendations.
I guess that would make the whole process more democratic, more in line with what people actually want. But would politicians ever actually agree to give up that much control over how much money they make?
Yeah, it's true that getting these kinds of changes passed would probably be a challenge, especially from those who are benefiting from the current system. But that's where public pressure comes in. If enough people demand transparency and accountability and are willing to speak up, real change is possible.
Yeah. Those protests in Kenya last June proved that people can really make a difference. It's inspiring, but also a little overwhelming. Like, where do we even start to tackle a problem this big?
Well, it starts with awareness, realizing there's a problem, talking about it, and demanding better from our leaders. And then it takes action, coming together as citizens, organizing ourselves, and pushing for reforms that put the public good ahead of personal gain.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive. We started out kind of laughing at the absurdity of it all and ended up talking about some really important questions about power representation and the future of democracy.
And that's what I love about these deep dives. We start with something that seems pretty straightforward and end up exploring these big ideas that affect all of us.
So for our listeners out there, we'll leave you with this. Don't underestimate your own power. Stay informed, stay engaged, and keep pushing for better from the people who represent you.
Oh.
Who knows, maybe you'll be the one to start the next wave of change. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.